The US and Israeli attack on Iran has plunged the Middle East into war. The resulting impact, beyond the loss of human life, is the destabilization of the global energy markets, which has predictably raised the price of energy around the world. Those who will profit from this war are the nations who currently control large quantities of oil and natural gas. Nations like the United States, whose recent intervention in Venezuela has substantially increased their access to a previously untapped supply. Since the 28th of February, the beginning of this new Iranian war, oil prices have sharply risen, with Brent crude oil prices jumping to a 14-month high. And this is likely just the beginning, with prices predicted to go over $100 a barrel in the event of a prolonged conflict. Quick update during editing. After just over a week, oil prices have now gone over $100 a barrel, the highest they have been since 2022. This war may be more costly than even the experts have accounted for.
Well, share prices have dropped and energy prices are rising as the economic impact of the war in the Middle East really begins to bite. The price of crude oil has risen above $100 a barrel as the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed and Iranian fuel depots are battered.
This will have knock-on effects on inflation and interest rates, causing considerable impact to an already worsening cost of living crisis around the world. This is happening because Iran has, in effect, closed the Hormuz Strait, a shipping route between Iran and its Gulf neighbours, and one of the most important arteries for global trade. It is through the Hormuz Strait that the OPEC Plus nations ship a large quantity of its exported supply, carrying about 20 million barrels of oil a day, roughly 1/5 of the global seaborne crude, as well as 20% of global liquefied natural gas, much of it from Qatar. Iran had warned all tankers in the strait within hours of being struck on the 28th that they would no longer be able to pass through. Emphasizing the closure of the water lane was the attack of 2 ships in the strait, one off of Oman and the other off the Emirates. Marine tracking sites show tankers piling up on either side of the strait, wary of attack and unable to move their cargo. Most of this oil is destined for Asia, but the globalized markets mean that the supply shock will ripple across the world as the Asian nations flock to other markets to compete for oil. Europeans will feel the cost of the war at the counter, with the spike in energy cost forecasted to cause inflation across the market and prevent interest rate cuts, which downstream impacts business spending and job market growth. The chief economist and head of investment strategy at Sarson & Partners said if oil prices remained high for a sustained period, it will start to cascade into other prices such as food, agriculture, and industrial commodities, driving inflation higher. The United States, on the other hand, imports very little from the OPEC nations impacted by this war. Saudi Arabia, the largest OPEC petroleum exporter to the United States, was the source of only 7% of the US petroleum imports, and another 7% of US crude oil imports. The United States, instead, imports most of its crude oil from Canada. In 2022, Canada was the source of 52% of US gross total petroleum imports, and 60% of gross crude oil imports. Beyond Canada, the US has recently forced open the Venezuelan market, ripe for US exploitation. The winners of this market instability, caused by the reignited Iranian conflict, is the US oil producers, who are seeing increased market demand and thus increased profits, meaning American supply becomes one of the few reliable alternatives. It is important to note that this analysis is being made from a macro geopolitical perspective, not from the perspective of an average American household. Rising oil and gas prices hurt ordinary Americans just as they hurt consumers around the world, driving up the cost of fuel, transport, and electricity. The United States, as a state, occupies a very different position within the global system. As one of the world's largest oil and natural gas producers, high global energy prices simultaneously increase revenue for American energy companies and strengthen the strategic leverage of the United States within the international energy markets. When you zoom out, the Hormuz shock doesn't just raise oil prices, it reshuffles leverage. Energy importing economies face inflation, stalled rate cuts, and political pain. Meanwhile, the United States, insulated by the North American supply, doesn't just survive the volatility, it can profit from it. And that raises a dark question. What if instability isn't just a risk to Washington? What if it's becoming a tool? Not necessarily to help oil companies, but to push the world into deeper dependence on American-controlled energy. In the 21st century, energy isn't just fuel. It's geopolitical leverage, and AI is turning that leverage into economic dominance. Recent actions and statements coming from the US indicate a move away from the old rules-based world order and to a more extractionary global structure, something akin to the old colonial powers. When examining the actions of the United States in the frame of a world power looking to control the world's oil supply, the actions coming from the Trump administration start to make a lot more sense. But why does the US need so much energy? Looking at the economy, we can identify a potential motive. The US economy's largest growing sector has been AI-related technology, a notoriously energy-hungry market segment. AI spending alone drove 0.4% of the Americans' 2025 GDP growth, representing roughly 20 to 39% of total growth, and is expected to have a similar impact in 2026. JP Morgan has reported that the coming years will see much higher growth driven by AI markets, saying official data primarily reflect the first phase of AI investment, emphasizing chips, servers, and networking equipment. This next phase is targeted towards supporting infrastructure such as power plants and grid upgrades, which can take years to plan, permit, and build. Early signs of this phase are emerging, but the full impact is likely ahead.
Welcome back to Squawk Box. I want to get right to our next guest here to talk markets, the economy, the Fed, deal-making, M&A, AI, healthcare, and so much more. Is Peter Orszag, he's the CEO of Lazard, former director, of course, of the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama. And I always think in this role you have your finger on the pulse of the corner office of businesses around the world, frankly. And I think we're all trying to figure out where things really are. We'll get some jobs numbers later today. But where do you think things really are right now?
I think things are good, confidence is high, but we also are living in a bifurcated world in which the U.S. economy in particular is increasingly a levered bet on AI. So the AI parts of the economy are booming and the rest is, I'd characterize as going sideways.
To support this growing market, in January, President Donald Trump announced a $40 billion investment pledge in US-based data centers from his business partner, Hussein Sajwani, and unveiled another $500 billion in planned investment in private sector AI infrastructure, as reported by Forbes. The biggest blocker for AI technology is the high energy consumption. US data centers consumed 183 terawatt hours of electricity in 2024. That works out to more than 4% of the country's total electricity consumption last year. This is roughly equivalent to the annual electricity demand of the entire nation of Pakistan. By 2030, this figure is projected to grow by 133% to 426 terawatt hours. This increased AI-driven energy demand is expected to impact the average American also, with Americans expected to see widespread price hikes in coming years. One study estimates that data centers and cryptocurrency mining could lead to an 8% increase in the average US electricity bill by 2030, potentially exceeding 25% in the highest demand markets. The need for expansion of the US energy market is clear. The highest growth sector in the US, AI, is growing the energy demand of the domestic market exponentially. And the energy feeding this market is overwhelmingly oil and natural gas. The United States' largest natural gas and oil importer is Canada, making up 60% of gross crude oil imports. This helps inform us as to why Donald Trump has been threatening to make Canada its 51st state. By taking control of Canada, the United States would gain a fully functional crude oil extraction and transportation market, one that is built to service American infrastructure. The entire Canadian crude oil market is based on American trade, and US refineries are specialised to refine Canadian crude oil. Canadian oil remains almost entirely in the continent refining system, with 98% of shipments processed by American refineries. Canadian oil doesn't need to be transported by sea. It is primarily sent down fixed pipelines. If the United States took Canada, it would gain full control of all this infrastructure and avoid the costly task of building its own pipelines and drills. Thankfully, no action has so far been taken against Canada. However, gaining control of this interconnected crude oil extraction and refining system seems to be an area of interest for the Trump administration. So, further threats against Canadian sovereignty would not be surprising as we move forward. Canada hasn't been the only United States ally whose sovereignty is under threat. Throughout 2025, Donald Trump made threats of annexation and offers of purchase against Greenland, and by extension, Denmark. Greenland contains approximately 31 billion barrels of oil. Previously, this oil has been near impossible to access, as the ice sheets on the mainland are too thick and logistical access too difficult. Off the coast, where most of the available crude oil is located, the ocean is also covered in ice, except for short periods over the summer. This means expensive to build icebreakers are required for transit for most of the year. However, as global temperatures increase, largely because of the use of non-renewable energy, the ice sheets covering Greenland and the surrounding oceans recede. And now, the inaccessible have become accessible. Greenland's natural wealth isn't limited to crude oil. It also contains a large number of critical raw materials that are needed for electronics in phones and computers. These resources would, of course, be invaluable to the United States AI market. Donald Trump's reasoning for wanting to acquire Greenland has been it's required for national security reasons. However, America already has authorization to station troops on the island, and despite that, in recent years, the US military presence on Greenland has been declining, with permanent active duty service members totaling a minuscule 130 people as of September 2025. Threats against Greenland have been met with resistance by a unified European response, with Denmark, UK, France, and others stationing military forces on the island to act as a deterrent to American aggression. This seems to have worked in the short term in staving off the United States, though, like Canada, the motivation for acquiring Greenland remains, and the US will likely turn its attention back to this region in the coming years. It is in South America that the United States has made its intentions most clear. On the 3rd of January 2026, the United States attacked the Venezuelan capital of Caracas and captured the president, Nicolas Maduro.
It's a long walk to face the wrath of American justice for Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia. Dressed in matching tan prison uniforms, they're led in handcuffs from a chopper, headed to their first court appearance, surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. It was an all-hands-on-deck operation getting the captured first couple of Venezuela from a detention center in Brooklyn to federal court in Manhattan.
The official reason for the attack, and subsequent capture of Maduro, was that Maduro was running a narco state and was deliberately allowing drugs to be trafficked into America, thus representing a national security threat. However, this justification has been questioned. Experts have said Venezuela is not a major drug producer and have described it as a minor cocaine transit country, with most of the cocaine flowing through Venezuela heading to Europe, not the United States. The majority of cocaine bound for the United States is believed to move not through the Caribbean, but through the Pacific, according to data from Colombia. The evidence suggesting that there was an ulterior motive to the attack became clear when the new acting president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, signed into law a bill making significant changes to the country's oil sector, after pressure from the US to open it up to foreign private investment. The new hydrocarbons law promises to give private companies control over oil production and sales, ease taxes, and allow for independent arbitration of disputes. Furthermore, Donald Trump's own statements on Venezuela paint a clear picture of what his objectives are. Trump posted on Truth Social on January 6, 2026, "I am pleased to announce that the interim authorities in Venezuela will be turning over between 30 and 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the United States of America. This oil will be sold at its market price, and that money will be controlled by me as the President of the United States of America to ensure that it is used to benefit the people of Venezuela and the United States." On January 9, 2026, Trump hosted several large US oil companies, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips, for a meeting about the South American country's oil. As of today, Reuters has reported that the US is expecting total oil sales between Venezuela and the US to equal $2 billion and reach $5 billion within a few months. Venezuela has seemingly become a vassal state of the United States, and its oil to be extracted to feed the ever-growing energy demand of the US economy. Viewing the actions of the United States from the frame of energy domination through the monopolization of oil explains the Trump administration's attacks against renewable energy sources. Since Donald Trump took office in 2025, he has launched a full-scale attack on renewable energy, repeating the climate hoax accusation many times.
Another UN official stated in 1989 that within a decade, entire nations could be wiped off the map by global warming. Not happening. You know, it used to be global cooling. If you look back years ago in the 1920s and the 1930s, they said, global cooling will kill the world. We have to do something. Then they said global warming will kill the world. But then it started getting cooler. So now they could just call it climate change because that way they can't miss. It's climate change. Because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, there's climate change. It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
The attack on renewable energy hasn't been constrained to the US domestic market, but has found its way to Europe. Reuters, reporting on the Athens Transatlantic Energy Cooperation Conference, wrote, "The message from US officials at the energy conference in Athens this week highlights the shift in US policy under the Trump administration, which has rolled back environmental regulations and touted oil and gas domination as a central driver for the US economy and its international influence. During this conference, we also saw US companies announce deals to supply and drill for gas in Europe. Chris Wright, the US Energy Secretary, made clear he wants to put a stop to green energy and for Europe to instead buy oil exclusively from the US. Beyond rhetorical attacks and corporate market infiltration,
energy makes people's lives better. And sort of the experiment the last 17 years, I think rightfully called the climate cult, has just driven up the price of energy. Europe as a whole produces less energy today than it did 17 years ago, and prices are dramatically higher. It's just moved jobs overseas to Asia. It's reduced economic opportunities for Europeans. It's made it harder to pay their bills. It made them very dependent on Russia. We want a strong, powerful, industrial, wealthy, prosperous Europe.
The US has also succeeded in removing climate change from the main priorities of the International Energy Agency after a tense meeting in Paris in January this year. If the US is successful in ending Europe's renewable energy development, they will succeed in ending Europe's chance, at least in the short term, of achieving energy security. Europe will instead be dependent on American oil and gas exports. The United States has already been benefiting from Europe's lack of domestic energy security, seeing a massive growth in exports to Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2023, Europe became America's largest oil and gas export destination, averaging 1.8 million barrels per day. The US, economically, has very little to lose and a lot to gain by the instability in the Middle East. First, the US has disrupted their oil-producing competitors, driving up demand for the American supply. Second, the regional instability will not see a large influx of migration to the US as they are separated from the situation by the Atlantic. Instead, it will be Europe and Asia that bear the burden of the inevitable immigration crisis. This in turn will likely raise the influence of far-right European political parties sympathetic to Trump's MAGA messaging. The weakness of the US energy monopolization framing is Washington's support for nuclear energy development. This support is evidenced by the administration cutting regulation that slowed down reactor development. NPR reported in January 2026 the Trump administration has overhauled a set of nuclear safety directives and shared them with the companies it is charged with regulating, without making the new rules available to the public. The sweeping changes were made to accelerate development of a new generation of nuclear reactor designs. The Department of Energy is currently overseeing a program to build at least 3 of these new experimental commercial nuclear reactors by July 4th of this year. Perhaps due to the long development time of nuclear reactors, the administration does not view nuclear as an obstacle to dominating the future energy market. By the time nuclear can feasibly phase out the oil-dominated energy grid, the United States will already have monopolized the computing and AI markets. Or perhaps I'm just wrong. Let me know what you think in the comments. When you step back and take a look at the big picture, a pattern begins to emerge. In the Middle East, conflict around Iran destabilizes one of the most important energy corridors in the world. In South America, Venezuela, home to the world's largest oil reserve, is forced open to foreign exploitation. In North America, Canada's energy infrastructure is already deeply integrated into the American system. And in the Arctic, Greenland's untapped resources suddenly become the subject of annexation threats and geopolitical pressure. Individually, each of these events can be explained away. But taken together, they start to suggest something much larger. A world where energy supply is increasingly concentrated in the hands of one power. And at the same time, the fastest growing sector of that power's economy, artificial intelligence, is becoming one of the most energy-hungry industries ever created. In that world, oil and gas are no longer just commodities. They become the foundation of a technological dominance. The United States presents these actions as a matter of national security, but the consequences extend far beyond security. They reshape global markets, undermine national sovereignty, and lock entire regions into dependence on American energy exports. For Europe, the lesson may be stark. As long as its economies rely on imported fossil fuels, its political and economic future will remain vulnerable to the decisions of the energy superpowers. True independence will not come from choosing between Russian gas or American gas. It will come from building an energy system that does not depend on either. Renewable power and nuclear energy may not just be the climate solution, they may be the geopolitical one. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please remember to like and subscribe.